Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Mustafa Yar Hiraj, and I, as president of the LSESU Pakistan Development Society, am honored to welcome you all to the third and final panel of the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020. The panel on the economy of Pakistan has been a much awaited one, and so I will get straight to it. Pakistan's economy has not seen a growth spurt that has lasted more than just a few years. This panel will explore why that has been the case and whether the time to reach across political divides in order to forge a consensus on the broad functioning of the economy has arrived. With that said, I am now pleased to introduce our speakers for this session. Our first speaker on the economy of Pakistan is none other than Mr. Hammad Azhar, who currently serves as the Federal Minister for Industries and Production. Mr. Hammad Azhar graduated with a bachelor's degree in development economics from SOAS, but went on to complete a postgraduate diploma in law. Having joined the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf in 2011, Mr. Hammad Azhar was elected to the National Assembly of Pakistan in 2018. Since then, he has served as both Federal Minister for Revenue as well as Economic Affairs until he was given his most recent portfolio of Industries and Production in April 2020. He has also had the distinct honor of presenting both of the PTI government's annual budgets before Parliament. His drive for economic development has not only received praise within Pakistan, but also at the international level, with the World Economic Forum naming Mr. Hammad Azhar as one of its young global leaders from South Asia. We are delighted to have Mr. Hammad Azhar at the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020 and firmly believe that this will be a great opportunity for us to understand the government's economic plan from its very own minister. Dr. Miftah Ismail, our second speaker on the Economy of Pakistan panel, is a Pakistani politician and political economist who served as the country's Federal Minister for Finance, Revenue, and Economic Affairs during the premiership of Mr. Shahid Khaqan Abbasi. After completing his PhD in public finance and political economy from the prestigious Wharton School, Dr. Miftah joined the International Monetary Fund before returning back to Pakistan in 1993 to join his family business, Ismail Industries Limited. He officially joined PMLN in 2011, and because of his public policy background, he was given several portfolios by the political party after they succeeded in forming the federal government in 2013. Dr. Miftah Ismail served on the board of directors of Pakistan International Airlines, as well as the Suez Southern Gas Company. In January 2014, he was appointed as the chairman, Federal Board of Investments, which went through complete restructuring during his leadership. He also started an automobile initiative that helped increase investment in the sector. We are delighted to host Dr. Miftah Ismail at the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020 and cannot wait to learn more from him about Pakistan's economy. Introducing our final speaker on the economy of Pakistan, Mr. Yousuf Nazar, who is a UK-based former independent investment manager with experience of handling private global fixed income and equity portfolios. Mr. Yousuf Nazar has previously headed Citigroup's emerging markets investments and has also served as its chief EM strategist with jurisdiction of almost 40 countries. His interest in the Pakistani political economy has clearly been demonstrated by the fact that some of his pieces have been published by the likes of Dawn, Daily Times, Naya Daur, and even Financial Times. In one such article titled How to Fix Pakistan's Economy, Mr. Yousuf Nazar shares an interesting perspective on Pakistan's recent economic developments and discusses possible future directions for the country. He has also authored a book named The Gathering Storm, Pakistan, Political Economy of a Security State. We are delighted to host Mr. Yousuf Nazar at the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020 and look forward to getting his specialist perspective on developmental routes forward. Introducing our moderator for this session, Faizan Dogar, who is an analyst at NIRA Economic Consulting, one of the most prestigious and oldest economic consulting firms. His current work focuses on the intersection of law and economics to help settle disputes related to intellectual property rights and antitrust laws. In 2019, Faizan graduated summa cum laude in mathematical economics from the University of Richmond, where he was also voted as the outstanding student in economics by the faculty. During 2017 to 18, he studied economics and mathematics at the LSE as part of his general course curriculum. With that said, I think we can now get the session underway. Over to you, Faizan.
Thank you, Mustafa, and thank you for the speakers in joining us. Like Mustafa laid out in the beginning what this panel is about, and it would be what the future of Pakistan's economy should look like. Will it be sort of a continuation of the consistent cycles of the balance of payments crisis and the on-swing instability and crashing growth momentum that we see? Part of the problem seems to be the state's inability to successfully raise tax revenues. And I would like to begin this part of the discussion by highlighting that the discourse on tax policy and administration, it has been very remarkably consistent for the past few decades. Every government, even every finance minister who starts off, they sort of start off with the same talking points. Low tax to GDP ratio needs to be risen. The base needs to be broadened. The share of direct taxation needs to be increased. Yet every government sort of fails to fully deliver on those promises. And I would like to give the floor to you, Mr. Hammad, on this thought. Do you think, in line with the manifesto of your party, which championed increasing the share of direct taxation, do you think that your party is equipped to sort of deal with the powerful political interest groups like the landed elite to sort of bring in their share of income into the tax net?
Thank you very much, Faizan. So the debate currently revolves around direct taxes and indirect taxes and the growing proportion of indirect taxes in Pakistan's tax landscape. And that is true. Our proportion of direct taxes is just 35 to 40%, and the remaining are indirect taxes. And this needs to reverse. For example, in France, the ratio is reversed, and in many other European Union countries. But where does the difference lie? The difference lies not in the VAT or the GST or the petroleum products taxation. In fact, it lies when we've done the analysis on the customs duties part. Pakistan is collecting a lot of taxes at the import stage. And other than this hindering our direct to tax, indirect tax ratio, this is also inhibiting trade flows, and I believe that it's inhibiting Pakistan becoming a part of the global value chains. That is one reason. The second reason is that Pakistan is not collecting enough direct taxes, and that has to do with enforcement and the tax culture in Pakistan. And the third reason is that we've become, I believe that we've become over the years a trading economy more than a manufacturing economy. And that is why the share of indirect taxation has grown, because the resultant impact on at the import stage is very high. And I think that this needs to reverse. So what my government has so far been doing, or we have been attempting in doing, and I believe we've been successful to some degree, is that we've been reducing taxes at the import stage, especially for the inputs and raw materials of products. And we're also reducing taxes at the finished stages as well, if it corresponds with the same tariff cascading principle that applies at the raw material stage. So this is something that we are attempting to do. We are also attempting to increase collection at the direct stage, and that requires reform and automation and digitization of the FPR process. It's an easier task which is said than done. It's a huge challenge, and successive governments have grappled with this challenge for a long time. But we are trying to move away from this, and I believe that this also plays in with the cyclical nature of our economies that you mentioned in your intro, that we go through cycles of boom and bust. Why is that? Well, there are many reasons for that. Some of the reasons are monetary, and some of the reasons are fiscal. But these taxes, they play the role of automatic stabilizers. So when your economy is overheating, you're pulling in the money supply and you're slowing it down. And when your economy is going through a slowdown, you're actually injecting more through elevated public spending into your economy and then raising it. So we call taxes as automatic stabilizers. But that doesn't work if the proportion of your direct taxes are very low, or if the tax to GDP ratio of the country is very low. That doesn't work at all. So this is something that we need to fix, and we are trying to move away from import-based taxes and more into direct-based taxes. But I would say that even in advanced economies, indirect taxes have become a large portion of their taxes, for example, on the VAT and petroleum products, even in the European Union countries. But the difference in Pakistan is the customs duty that our analysis shows, that the regulatory duties, the customs duties. And just one last comment I'd like to squeeze in here is that I believe that the direct versus indirect debate in Pakistan is a little confused. There are a lot of taxes that are classified and categorized as direct taxes, but in fact they are indirect taxes. For example, withholding taxes and advance income taxes. Now, if you look at the FBR statistics or the Economic Survey of Pakistan, where it's reported, you will see them classified as direct taxes. But in a country where 99% of people do not file their returns, these adjustable taxes in fact become non-adjustable, and they become indirect taxes, and they become a part of the cost of the transaction. So perhaps the situation is far worse actually than what the statistics reflect, and that makes the challenge even greater. But my government is committed to removing this dichotomy, and we're moving towards a system that is lesser reliant at the import stage, with the greater reliance on direct taxes. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments on that, Mr. Hammad. I would like to sort of briefly follow up on some of the things you talked about. You said that we need to increase general manufacturing to sort of enhance the share of direct taxation. Yet manufacturing sector already pays a lot of more share in taxes than it's accounted for in the GDP, while the other sources of direct income, for example, the agriculture, which accounts for 20% of the GDP, yet in terms of its share in the revenue, it's around, it's a meager 1% or so. So my question to you beginning was, while I do acknowledge that there are so many inefficiencies in the form of withholding taxes, which are regressive in nature, I would like to bring you back to sort of address the specific point, which was at the end of the day, to be able to bring in different sources of income into the tax net. The government does need to sort of politically take on these powerful interest groups, like the landed elite, also it's called. And so I'd like to sort of give the question back to you again, specifically on that, and mention that the manner of your former FBR chief's resignation does suggest to some extent that the government has had troubles dealing with the so-called landed elite.
Right. So no, I did not imply at any part in my conversation that we should levy more taxes at the manufacturing stage. In fact, levying most taxes at the manufacturing stage will not mean that we're collecting more direct taxes at all. I mean, right now, for example, 300 to 500 companies, the top companies pay 75% of Pakistan's taxes. A large number of those taxes are actually indirect taxes. Those companies are actually just collecting agents. So no, imposing more taxes at the manufacturing stage will not cut it. Although taxing people, whatever their source of income, based on their income is where the direct taxes will come from. And you are right that in Pakistan the agriculture sector needs to be taxed. The challenge here is that agriculture has become a provincial subject, and its taxation has also become a provincial subject. And the provincial revenue authorities are, although they are trying their best in all provinces, and they have posted some decent improvements, almost all of them in all provinces, but they are just a shadow of the taxes that the Federal Board of Revenue collects. I mean, if the Federal Board of Revenue is, like, for example, 4,500, 5,000 billion taxes, then all of the provincial revenue agencies combined do not even collect maybe 5% of those taxes, whereas they have huge swaths of the economic sectors available to them to collect taxes from, and agriculture is one of them. So there are many different proposals on this count. For example, one is that perhaps there should be a national tax authority, or maybe FBR should be empowered by the provinces to collect these agriculture taxes and then remit them back to the provinces. So maybe that would be a more efficient single window solution for the taxpayers and the tax collector as well, because FBR already has a fair degree of presence throughout the country. So that's just one suggestion. The other is that the provincial revenue authorities need to scale up their efforts and, you know, really go after all the avenues where the remit of collecting taxes lies with the provinces. So that is the other option that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Ahmad. Like you say, the issue has now been devolved to provinces, and I would like to address Mr. Nazar now that tax collection remains an issue, and like I said earlier, the powerful interest groups, they do get in the way of tax reform. And so I would like to give the floor to you, Mr. Nazar, asking what is it about the nature of the political economy of Pakistan that makes reform efforts in the state of the taxation regime very hard to go through. I think you might be on mute, Mr. Nazar.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Did you hear my question?
Yes, I heard your question. Thank you for that. And I think we need to think of tax reforms within the wider framework of the political economy. And also look at the past and what we can learn from the past and what has not worked. Within the last 30 years or so, Pakistan has gone to the IMF about 15 times, since 1980. And in total, about 22 times. The tax to GDP ratio in 1981 was 14%. It has been around in the recent years, 9 to 10%, sometimes above 10%, but not much more. In the late 70s, an IMF technical assistance mission led by a Harvard-trained economist, Mr. Vito Tanzi, was the first to broach the issue of the VAT. And then a GST was legislated by the political governments in 1990. And there was a major effort to reform the tax. In 2004, there was a World Bank project. The loan was about $150 million, if I recall correctly. And then by the end of the decade, the tax to GDP ratio had actually declined to less than 9%. Even last year, 2019, the project loan was extended by the World Bank for $400 million to reform the tax system. So in the last, I think out of 30 years, 23 years, Pakistan has been under the IMF programs. So the involvement of the multilaterals in Pakistan has been much more than probably most other countries in the world. What has not worked? What is the issue? I recall my conversation with a senior official of the World Bank, I won't name him, about 12 years back. And I asked him that actually the issue of taxation in Pakistan is not that problematic. We can learn from the other economies that have done well, that have moved forward. What is the issue? And his answer was, your powerful elites are not interested in the tax reforms. And that was quite a shocking revelation to me in terms of his candor, not that I did not agree with that. And a part of the reason is the political will, not just the political will. I think the lack of realization on the part of the powerful political elites that actually a good tax system might and most likely would help them more in the longer term, because the country would be more stable and it will have better growth prospects. It will attract more investments. But that realization, I think, has to come at the top level. And I don't mean in terms of the level of government, I mean at the level of whoever are the stakeholders at the top level in Pakistan are. I would like to submit one thing, and we have to see what has gone wrong. Since 1990 to the last year, India's GDP per capita in purchasing power parity terms, in real terms, has grown at an average of 6.3%. Bangladesh at 6.3% also. Low and middle income countries, 5.2%. Pakistan, 3.3%, which is closer to the growth levels in sub-Saharan Africa. I think we need to think about this in a broader context. As far as I'm concerned, I think we have to think out of the box. We have to think out of this structural adjustment framework that the multilaterals have been pushing for a very long time, as I just outlined, and think what the successful countries have done. And there are some common elements. The number of taxes are few. The administration, it is easy to administer. The minimum number of exemptions, we have a huge number of exemptions, historically. To make one point, Pakistan ranks about 136th worldwide in the World Bank's ease of doing business, and 172 in terms of ease of paying taxes. The tax authorities in Pakistan have a lot of discretionary powers. They sometimes can impose taxes without even going to the parliament, which is very unusual in 2020. So the one level, we need to think in terms of simplification of both the laws and the administrative structure, and removing a lot of the discretionary powers. And on another level, we need to demonstrate through practical examples on the part of the ruling elites, be it in the military or on the civilian sides or on the bureaucracy, that they really are serious about the reforms, and it is not just a matter of satisfying some multinational to get more loans and get on with it, and to basically we always in a crisis mode. We always think about next few weeks or next few months. We don't think about deeper structural, long-term sustainable reforms that serve the long-term interest of the country. I think political will and the simplification of both the structure and the overall framework, I think these points need to be made, breaking if you want to break from the past.
Thank you so much for those comments, Mr. Nazar. Dr. Ismail, now I'm addressing you, and to sort of summarize, Mr. Yusuf's focus seems to be the lack of political will. There is a lot of simplification that needs to be done. Your party at some point supported the idea of agricultural taxes, yet failed to implement them. Even though the tax to GDP ratio in the last government's tenure did go up, it was mostly on the basis of indirect taxes itself. Why is it that your government failed to deliver on its promises? What can the current government learn from it, and will the opposition support the current government in terms of the tax reforms that are agreed upon within the wider academic community in terms of simplification, garnering the political will to sort of take on the powerful interest groups? I think you might be on mute, Dr. Ismail.
Thank you very much, Faizan. I've actually enjoyed listening to my two colleagues on the conference here, and also I think I'll take advantage of the very economically literate audience that you probably have, and talk a little bit more basic. Let me just question the premise of your talking point, your question, which is that we need to increase tax to GDP ratio, or we need to increase more taxes. The question I want to ask first is why? Why should we have to have more taxes? What is the cost to the economy of raising more taxes? What is the deadweight loss that we create, the excess burden, the burden we put on the economy for raising taxes? I think, look, they talk about, Hobbes talked about this life being nasty, brutish, and short, right? So you form governments to ensure that there is some civilian, some structure that maintains civility, that runs the country, and you have a constitution according to which you run the country, and then you tax the people, and you understand that you are taxing a group of very poor people with very low per capita GDP. And then you also look, and then so you should not be comparing Pakistan to Northern Europe, where the per capita GDP is maybe 50,000 US dollars per year. Then you also look at what is the cost of these taxes. Everybody understands fine, that we should raise more taxes, but we have to keep in mind the fact that raising taxes is not costless. It costs a lot of money to the economy. It's not clear to me, but I think that maybe a rupee raised in taxes maybe is causing 30 paisas loss to the economy in terms of lost, distortions created. I give you an example of how FBR thinks. In my year as finance minister, the prime minister and I decided that we should, reduce tax rates for individuals, because individuals are the most highly taxed people in Pakistan, especially salaried individuals, because these are the people whose salaries is deducted at source, and other people just sort of try and evade taxes and whatnot. So we asked them what would happen if we reduce the tax rates to 15% from 25 or 30% that it was. And they came back and they said that the number is 80 billion, that you will lose 80 billion rupees. And I'm like, how did you calculate that? And they just told me that, look, we took the number, the taxes we took in last year, multiplied it by 15, divided it by 25, and we got 80 billion. I'm like, what happens to the money that I give to those people? Do they spend money in consumption? Do I get sales tax back? What happens to the economy? What happens to the multiplier effect? None of that, okay? So we have to also not just, blindly think about raising taxes, but we have to also consider what are the cost of raising taxes, what sort of taxes that we want to raise. Hammad talks about direct and indirect taxes, and he's absolutely right that even what we consider direct taxes really are indirect taxes. These withholding taxes, at the custom stage, ports, at the import stage, you charge an imported good customs duty, import tariff. You charge them a sales tax, but then you charge them something called income tax, 5%, 6%, 2%, depending on the good. And that's just a full and final tax in most cases that you charge them. That's also, and we consider that to be a direct tax, but it's really not a direct tax. It's an indirect tax. So I'm actually now sort of not sure that, that following the IMF prescriptions or for doing what we are doing for the last God knows how many years is the right thing to do. I mean, somebody said, I think Einstein said that, or at least he's supposedly famous for saying this, that it's, it's the definition of insanity is trying to do the same thing and expecting different results. What we need to do is to understand that fine, maybe we are resigned to just doing indirect taxes, but we should just do taxes which correlate with rich incomes, rather than, I mean, for instance, if you are taxing, food stuff, okay, that is a direct cost, a disproportionately high cost to the poor. But if, for instance, you're doing indirect taxes on luxury good items, you're fine. One of my favorite taxes now, and that's also a provincial tax, is actually property tax. I am not particularly gung ho about agriculture tax. I think that that farming in Pakistan is actually too uncompetitive as is with the rest of the world, and to have FBR or even very empowered provincial tax authority go at them would be disastrous for our farm output. I think we have to really think about that. Maybe so. I would actually tax it on land, not on farm income. Similarly, I think that there should be a very rigorous property tax in Pakistan. Maybe if they rejig the NFC, which I think that they need to, maybe they can talk about the fact that property taxes can be shared between federation and the provinces. But we really, I mean, especially idle property, speculative property, we really need to tax that at a higher rate, because that's where Pakistanis store wealth in land more than any other place. So if this is the biggest store of value, why not just tax that and stop taxing like everyday stuff, food stuff and things like that. So my message is, or my thing is that increase taxes because you have very large deficits and you have expenses, but think about also the expenses you bear. See if you can cut down some of those expenses. And I know politically none of that is easy. I mean, you know, it's difficult for PMLN, it's difficult for PTI, it's difficult for any political party. I know that. I mean, but I'm just saying, I mean, because, you know, this is a different sort of audience, I'm sort of thinking that, you know, what Pakistan needs to do if you want to go out of this, you know, low growth trap that Yousuf Saab talked about, you know, growing at 3%, 3.25%, where your population is growing at 2.5%. I mean, that's not something to be proud of. That's kind of, you know, really sad for Pakistanis, and something that we need to really think about. So my thing is that you think about what taxes you want to raise, what is the impact of that tax on economic growth, and what is the impact of that tax on the very poor people of Pakistan, and that try and come up with something new. Let's not try to, you know, ape the West or whatnot, because we are very different. We have a very different culture, and so a lot of those things that, you know, that they try and succeed in the West, we don't succeed in Pakistan. So that's where I'll, you know, start off with.
Thank you, Dr. Ismail. Like you said, it's sort of insanity to do the same thing again and again, expecting the same result. The consensus seems to be that, yes, it's politically hard to sort of take on measures like taxing direct sources of income. What's another thing about the Pakistani economy that has remained the same, other than the state of its taxation regime, has been the state of domestic productivity. And let's be frank, for any long-run growth trajectory to be sustained, it cannot be sustained without a rising domestic productivity. And here I would like to sort of motivate this discussion by showing one of the measures of productivity here. If you all can see, and Mr. Nazar, this is a graph that I took from one of your published articles. It clearly lays out how Pakistan has lagged far behind India and Bangladesh in terms of its exports per capita. The differential seems to have gone up to 7 times. What is it about India and Bangladesh that they were able to do and we are not able to do, and hence we see stagnancy in our domestic productivity?
Are you asking me?
I addressed this question to Mr. Nazar.
Okay, thank you, Faizan. As you can see that over a long period of time, you know, India's and Bangladesh exports since 1990 have outperformed Pakistan's by a factor of 6, more than 6 times in terms of exports per capita. And this phenomena is very deeper, it's structural. It is more than just about civilian or military governments, or, you know, the energy shortages, or not, you know, no energy shortages, you know, little energy shortages like recently. I will pick one kind of statistic. In Pakistan, the adult female literacy ratio is about 46%, nearabouts. In Bangladesh, it is 70%. So in terms of human development, we have been left behind, you know, by decades. And while many governments in Pakistan, many analysts, policymakers, stakeholders talk about foreign aid, foreign investments, be it from the United States or China or from other, you know, sources, not adequate attention has been paid to human development. And we learn from, let's say, from the East Asian experience, from be it Taiwan or South Korea or Singapore or Malaysia, that the key to development for their fast growth rate has been human development. Also in China, with their trained and skilled and educated, you know, manpower. In our case, there is a case of, we have a double jeopardy. 50% of our population, that is the women, the females, they have a very low, you know, participation in the actual labor force. Not just that, our adult female literacy rate is quite low. And on top of it, we have a political economy which is essentially a rent-seeking economy. If you look at the composition of the exports, for example, 30 years back, it is more or less the same, it's similar. You know, we still a commodity producing country. And so what has happened? And look at technology and so on and so forth. So that we have to address the fundamental issues. And the fundamental issues, I think one is that our low savings rate, you know, no country in the world, you know, I'm talking about the developing countries, they have progressed with the kind of saving rates, which is about, you know, mid-teens, you know, sometimes low teens, sometimes high teens, but still, again, it is much more closer at about 18 or 19%, pick a number that you like, compared to other countries in Asia, which have really, you know, for example, Bangladesh has a savings to GDP ratio of 33%. India is about 31%. The world average is about 25%. We are not only below the world average, our average is even below those of the heavily indebted poor countries.
And as I understand, Dr. Nazar, savings need to translate into investments as well. And that's one of the things.
That's right. So we need to pay attention to two things. One is how can we boost domestic resources and mobilize domestic, you know, sources. And number two, what can we do on an emergency basis, on a very urgent basis, to improve the level of and the skills of the workforce that we have. We can cut the tax rates, sure, to attract foreign investment, but that is not enough. A very key component of where the investments, you know, investment go is the quality of the talent, the quality of the manpower. We are fond of saying that Pakistan has a lot of talent, but I'm sorry, the reality from a bigger international perspective is quite different, and it is quite disappointing. So we need to address those fundamental issues. We seem to obsess about things like the privatization. Well, let me give you something. In countries like, for example, India, you know, there is a huge banking sector that is still under the state control. In Singapore, the most dominant players in the financial sector are state controlled, so as that in China. But despite, you know, having done the privatization of most of the banking sector in Pakistan, and I hear the people are saying that, okay, let the markets allocate capital. What has happened? I think, to me, I have a very, very, you know, acute sense that we are not looking outwards sufficiently. We are not looking at the success examples. We tend to look towards countries like Turkey, for example, or Saudi Arabia, or we talk about the developed world, the United States, or UK and France. What about Singapore? What about South Korea? What about Taiwan? The countries that have made miraculous progress in the last 40 years. Can we learn from them? They are closer to Asia and closer to us. And in 1965, for example, Malaysia and Singapore were one country. But we talk more about Malaysia, not about Singapore, which actually has progressed much more rapidly than Malaysia. So I think there is a need to look outwards, but look outwards in the right direction. We should stop obsessing about what the IMF or the World Bank economists tell us. They have been heavily involved in countries like Argentina. And I'm sorry to say, Argentina has been a disastrous experience. Why don't we talk about Chile? Chile, the maximum tax rate about 17%. Argentina is significantly higher, but Chile has done. And I would say Chile is probably the only country in Latin America whose GDP growth per capita on a purchasing power parity basis compares with that of some of the top performing Asian tigers. So we need to, you know, think about these issues. We need to think out of the box. we need a clear break from the past. And as I think Miftah Ismail rightly said, our bureaucracy, they have a huge capacity issue. You know, just look at how many economists we have in our, Mr. Hammad can tell us, and you know, in our ministries like Commerce and Finance, who are really qualified to understand and analyze issues. My suspicion is that very few, or maybe none. And so those issues need to be addressed, and we need to come out of this trap of short-termism. What happens? Well, if we continue
Mr.
to
Nazar, sorry
deny,
to cut you off, but here I'd like to bring in the other panelists' perspectives in this section of the
Sure.
discussion as well. And you rightly invoked their names because they've had experience within government, and I'm addressing Dr. Ismail to you now, as you've held the Ministry of Investment and the Portfolio of Investment and Trade in the previous tenure. Even though the GDP growth did kick up in the past year's tenure, past government's tenure, as Mr. Nazar pointed out, the savings rate and the investment rates of the economy, they've remained largely the same. Do you agree with Dr. Nazar, Mr. Nazar, that it has to do more with our policies on human development and sort of the inefficiencies of the bureaucracy that result in low savings and investment? I think you're on mute again. Dr. Ismail, I think you might be on mute. Okay.
I started with saying someone just messaged me to ask what was I drinking, and I said iced tea. So just to clarify that. Look, this question of how do you increase growth in Pakistan is a very, very difficult question to answer. And obviously one reason nobody's figured this answer out, right? Because otherwise we would be growing fast. And we haven't really grown fast. I mean, the best we've done is like 6-7%. But countries that have really left poverty behind, countries that have increased the size of their middle classes, like Japan in the 1950s and 60s, Korea in 70s and 80s, China in the 1990s and aughts. I mean, these countries grew by 10% for 20 years, just quadrupling the per capita GDP. We're not even close. I mean, we're not even close to Bangladesh and India now. And I remember telling then Prime Minister Abbasi, in fact, I've been said this to Mia Nawaz Sharif one time we were giving a presentation, that, previous finance ministers used to compare Pakistan to Malaysia and Singapore and all that. And I was an investment manager. We were comparing ourselves to Bangladesh and, other countries. And I said, maybe, in 10 years from now, ministers will be comparing, to Afghanistan, and God knows where else. So, I mean, history of Pakistan, unfortunately, is a trajectory that's going down. How do we get growth? Savings and investment is one point. I'll come to savings and investment in a minute. I mean, I've actually tried to really look at it in the last few months, think about very hard about what is it that Pakistan lacks that, doesn't bring growth, rapid growth to Pakistan. And there are many factors. I mean, I think that, law and order is a very large factor. This flirting with terrorism and the Taliban and all sorts of organizations and all sorts of stuff that was going on in Pakistan. And yes, now these terrorist incidents are basically next to zero, but it takes a while for perceptions to become improved. I remember in 2014, there were 22 or 23 foreign airlines that used to land in Shah Jamal Airport in Dhaka. That was more than Karachi, Lahore, and Islamabad put together. Okay, that number of foreign airlines. Okay, you hardly see foreigners in Pakistan. We talk about $2 billion worth of investment. Maybe it will go up by $100 million, and the government of the day would be really happy. It would go down by $100 billion. They would be chastised. But we're talking about $2 billion. I mean, in a country the size of Pakistan, where even at 15%, let's say, investment, is $45 billion. If you have 30%, investments in Pakistan, you need $90 billion, right? And you're talking about $2 billion of foreign investment. That's nothing. I mean, that's essentially, close to zero. So there are lots of things. So, I mean, I think the first factor really is terrorism and perception of Pakistan abroad and how nobody really wants to come to Pakistan. People are scared of coming to Pakistan. Then doing business with anything to do with our government is disastrously difficult. I mean, it really is difficult, whether for Pakistanis or foreigners. And you don't even see Pakistanis investing, a lot in Pakistan. So why would foreigners come and invest? Then, of course, our budgetary situation is really difficult. I mean, you talked about, raising taxes. The fact is that even if you double the Pakistani tax, Pakistani budget deficit will not go away. Even if you double the tax. If you now change the NFC award, for instance, and you stop giving money to the provinces, sure, federation deficit will go down, but the provincial deficits will go up. And they're not even allowed to borrow. So the total deficit, which includes our federal and provincial deficit, will remain the same. And how will they spend money on education and health? And then, Yousuf Saab talked about, not spending enough money on development of human resources. It's not even clear to me that we are educating any of our children in public schools or even in many of the private schools. I mean, I think we are wasting their times. They have talked. There's people who've done a lot of research on this, and they've asked very basic questions to 9th grade students in biology. And even 9th grade teachers in biology who didn't understand anything about biology. There are issues with languages. Sometimes you're teaching stuff in Urdu to kids who speak Sindhi or Pashto at home. Sometimes you're speaking in English, teaching in English to kids who speak Urdu or Punjabi at home. There are lots of issues that we need to sort. There was one thing that was really bothering me, that you see Bangladesh's exports increasing very rapidly. And yet, for instance, the wages were higher in Pakistan than were in Bangladesh. And I sort of wondered why that is, that if our wages are higher, which means that our productivity has to be higher, why is it that Bangladeshi exports are going up faster than Pakistan? It turns out that a lot of women in Bangladesh are also willing to work. They're part of the labor force, and they were willing to work for a lower wage than even what we would call sustenance wage. But, with the household, that big incomes become higher. We don't even have women in the workforce. And so lots of factors have happened. So really, I mean, it's beyond any one government's capacity or capability. It's beyond any few years problem. But these are substantial problems in Pakistan. We have to improve the image of Pakistan and the reality of Pakistan. Whether it's we have to make it an easy state. There was a book called Pakistan Hard State. I mean, we have to make it an easy state. Then you have to educate your children, educate your young generation really well, which we have really failed our young generation. So, I mean, we don't spend enough money on schooling, and it's not even clear to me that schooling equals education in Pakistan. Then there are government finances issues that I talked to you about, that we need to sort of sit down and think about and sort. There are other governance issues in Pakistan all the time. There are very many stakeholders that are at each other's throats all the time. So those issues need to be sorted out and settled. It's not so easy. Finally, let me just talk to you about investments and savings. So, when you run a large budget deficit, that money has to come from either private savings over investments or foreigners, sending you their savings. There is no third source. So when we were running budget deficits, that money was being partly or mostly financed by foreigners' savings, which is what translates into a current account deficit, right? So we had a budget deficit of about 6.5% in my last year, and we had about 6% of GDP, about 6% of GDP current account deficit, which was very high, of course. But that basically means that foreigners are financing your budget deficit. Now the current account deficit has really come down. In fact, it's become a positive, but your budget deficits still are at 9% and now 8%. So something has to give. So that really means that investment is even lower than what it used to be. or you are somehow getting this IOUs towards future current account deficits. I don't know. So there are very fundamental issues with our investment and savings that we need to address. And why would anybody save in Pakistan? Let me just take half a minute longer and then talk about this. We sometimes have abrupt devaluations. We sometimes have abrupt changes in duty structures. Abrupt structures in tax structures. So if you have money today, okay, you could save, or you could just spend. People in Pakistan normally just spend. So there is not much savings. And I think that the savings that they do, they I think prefer to do it outside of Pakistan. I mean, or some, seriously, because our culture cannot be that separate, different from Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and India. And if they are savings at 28%, 30%, 31%, and we are saving at 12% of GDP, there's something going on here, which I don't quite understand, but there's something going on. Either there's something issues with the numbers or some behavioral issues. Thank you.
On this note, I would like to bring in Mr. Hammad Azhar to the continuing discussion on domestic productivity. The consensus seems to be Dr. Nazar and Mr. Nazar and Dr. Ismail, they both agree that spending on human capital is quite limited, which reflects into low savings and investment rate. Currently, you are the Minister of Industries and Production, Mr. Hammad Azhar. The state of Pakistan seems to be sort of present in almost every sphere of economic activity and interfering in the sort of business of the markets. I ask you this, what role then does the Competition Commission of Pakistan or the government in general has in terms of ensuring that it's easier for businesses or new entrants to enter into the market, while at the same time the state interferes to protect the inefficient ones?
Right. So let me just start off by sustainable growth. What do we mean by sustainable growth? We mean growth which does not come at the expense of deficits or balance of payments problems, like it always has in most of the economic history of Pakistan. And there's no rocket science. If you want sustainable growth, you need to have a high investment ratio. You need to have high savings, and that will translate into productivity, and that growth will be sustainable growth. And let me, for the economists sitting here, let me clarify another one thing. We have a savings of 11%, and then we have a slightly higher investments rate. What's the gap called? What is the gap between savings and investment called? It's called the current account deficit. That's the imported savings that you're bringing into the system. And that's why we do not have sustainable growth, because we grow on the back of very low amount of savings. And then we have this imported investment coming in. Most of it is in the form of consumption products. So that's a part of it is also lost away. So, that is where the current account deficit comes in. The new government comes in, it has to apply the brakes, it has to stabilize the economy. And by the time it stabilizes the economy, maybe 1 or 2 years have passed. And then there is that little room for structural reforms. Now, every government has two options. Either it can go into structural reforms, or it can start looking at the next elections, and it can start having a loose fiscal and monetary policy. And then we'll end up again after 3 years in the same exact position where we started again. So we have low savings, we know that. And there are many different theories on why that may be the case, why that may not be the case. But one of the reasons is that the whole economic universe exists on the basis of accurate factor prices in the economy. I mean, you cannot have an overvalued exchange rate and then you don't send the right signals to your industrialists. I mean, because you're subsidizing imports, and then when you have a fixed exchange rate, and with the rising domestic inflation, your exchange rate is actually appreciating, and you're actually causing your exports to go in uncompetitive. And that's what happened. Our exports to GDP ratio declined from 13 to 9% in just 5 years. So there are some structural reforms that need. One is that we need to have a free floating exchange rate, a market-driven exchange rate, no matter what the political costs may be. I think that is one consensus that needs to exist in our society. The second is that one of your themes as well is the state bank's autonomy. It must have the autonomy to not allow the economy to overheat. That cannot be dictated by political constraints. You cannot have a political government that decides that just because the elections is a few months away, we are going to have a low interest rate, we're going to shove away all of our foreign exchange savings. This cannot happen again. And I'm not political point scoring or anything. I genuinely believe that the state bank's autonomy as regards the monetary policy is a must. Secondly, taxation. Look, it's very easy to say that we can do away with taxes. But the fact is that a large number of people in Pakistan owe taxes that they do not pay. It is not wrong to collect taxes from the people who make a large sum of money and they are not paying any taxes. There are two ways of raising taxes. One is that you increase the tax rate. The second is that you go about collecting taxes and broadening the tax base. There is nothing wrong with the latter. In fact, you need the latter because, Pakistan needs huge public investments right now. We have failing infrastructure. We have huge educational gaps where the state needs to step in. We have one of the most malnourished children in the world. The state needs to step in. And for this purpose, we need taxes. But we don't need to raise the tax rates. We need to broaden the tax base. We've also had this discussion on the state-owned enterprises and the banking sector. And we've been compared with India. Let me tell you that India's non-performing loans in the state-run banking sector are many times higher than Pakistan's. Our non-performing loans are about 8%, which is one of the best in the emerging economies of the world. We do not want to replicate India's fail. Do you know what is happening in India right now? Banks are failing. Their whole economic landscape is being made fragile just by the fact of failing banks. We do not have that, at least in Pakistan, so we should not go in that direction. Then in the same breath, we say that, it's okay to not tax, but then, you can't keep spending the way that we are. Post 18th Amendment, there has been a huge windfall gain to provinces. But what have the provinces done with that windfall? They've increased the size of the state. They've increased the salaries of their civil servants. They've increased the number of government employees in the provinces. So the size of the state has grown as a result of that windfall gain. And at the same time, the federal government that needed to shut down many of its institutions has not shut them down. So what are we doing now? We've actually increased the size of the state. We've actually increased the size of public spending that's going into the unproductive sectors. I'm not talking about development spending. I'm talking about just the current expenditures, the salaries and pensions part right now. We have increased that by a huge amount. And yet there are no taxes to back that up. So there are now only two options that we have. One is that we must reduce unproductive spending in the economy. And a large part of it is in the public sector, obviously. The second is that we have to start raising taxes, not necessarily by increasing taxes, but by broadening our tax base and collecting the huge swaths of land. And I completely agree with Miftah Ismail Saab on the agricultural taxes part as well. I mean, it's a two-way debate. We have a large number of low land holding as well. I mean, it's very difficult to tax on the basis of land size as well, because we see what happens. People start dividing it into smaller units, and the market is very they have this creativity of somehow circumventing these measures. So we have these very small land holdings now throughout Pakistan, and we have an unproductive agriculture sector as well. That is one of the main drags on our economy. But at the same time, the beauty of direct taxes is that irrespective of the output you're producing, you're taxing on income, and you can have different thresholds. You can start taxing agricultural income at a higher threshold or something like that. But I think that anyone who owes taxes, and anyone they should be paying taxes. There are huge areas where the state needs to step into, and there are huge areas in Pakistan where the state needs to step out of. For example, the state-owned enterprises, the failing state-owned enterprises. For example, the huge current expenditures that our provincial and federal governments are running that they do not need to run. And this needs huge structural reforms. They need huge political will to take these decisions. I mean, my ministry has recently taken a decision on the Pakistan steel mill, which was draining resources at a phenomenal exponential rate. Imagine if those same resources, 200 billion or more, would have been put into the public sector development project, the kind of jobs and the kind of infrastructure that we would have created. So we need to, I think that that is what I would say in the end. That the structural issues in Pakistan, we need to raise the savings rate. We need to bridge the gap between the savings and investment rate. We need to cut public expenditure. The size of the government needs to be cut as well. And at the same time, we need to not really, compare our banking sector with the India's state-run banking sector, which is not a good example, I think.
Thank you for those comments, Mr. Hammad Azhar. I would have one more question before I open the floor to questions from the audience. And that is, we broadly talked about, there seems to be the same talking points even in this panel in terms of spending on human development, increasing investment rate and savings rate would involve sort of taking politically difficult decisions of giving autonomy to the central bank. And I would like to ask your thoughts, Mr. Nazar, quite briefly, if you could summarize in 2 to 3 minutes, that do you think can such a consensus, broad consensus on key macroeconomic policies as to the functioning of like whether we will do inflation targeting or will we have a market-based exchange rate? Do you think such a consensus is possible in Pakistan? And I would like you to keep your comments brief before I open the floor to questions from the audience.
That's a great question. I believe that it is best conceptually to let the market determine the rates, but they should include all rates. Are the energy prices in Pakistan determined by the markets? Are they free from government intervention? Are the commodity prices, for example, wheat to sugar, are they, free from government intervention? So when we talk about market prices, I think that should apply to all the prices. It should not be selective. And when I talk about for example, some other country, it doesn't mean that we are trying to follow them. I'm just provoking. I'm asking a question. Why some countries, despite having those issues, have progressed much at almost double the rate than we have. So that is the question, is not a matter of comparison. And when I give the example of not just India, but also Singapore. Singapore has a dirty float. I'm sorry, it doesn't have a free floating rate. So does Malaysia, so does Taiwan. And so as a practitioner, I probably have dealt with exchange rates across emerging markets. There is an obsession in Pakistan on the part of some academics with exchange rates. You can free up the exchange rates, but Pakistan's foreign exchange has depreciated by about 40% since 2014, but exports have not budged. You can go back to 1990s. The exchange rate has depreciated much more compared to India, Bangladesh, or Vietnam, but their exports have really left us far behind. What are the reasons? So I'm all for exchange rates, for free exchange rates, but that should not be selective. As they say, the losses in some cases are privatized, but the profits, profits are privatized and the losses are socialized. That should not be the case, but that seems to be the case in Pakistan, because to sum up, it remains an overwhelmingly, a rent-seeking economy. There is too much state. Let's talk about the defense expenditure at about, close to 4% of the GDP. It is the largest item after debt servicing. We need to have a debate on that. I'm not saying one way or the other, but let's talk about the real issues. It is not the civilian expenditures, it is the defense expenditure, which is the largest. So I would say that we should not obsess too much about free floating rates. Most of the developing world is on dirty float. Let's focus on fundamentals like human development, like freeing up the markets. Both state and the multilaterals have failed, and we need to learn from India again, particularly from its reforms that started in the 1990s. And the key part, the most significant part of the reforms was deregulation. Let the state get out of the way of the private sector. We need sweeping reforms to deregulate the economy so that the energies and the talents of the people can be harnessed to a better Pakistani future. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. Nazar. I will now ask questions that have been coming in throughout the course of the discussion. The first one that I would ask is addressed to Mr. Hammad Azhar, and it is, we have had a great discussion about savings and investments. I have a two-pronged question regarding that. What is the current government going to address the issues of financial literacy in Pakistan?
Sorry, can you repeat the question because I couldn't hear you.
Sorry about that. The question that has seems to come in is, we have had a great discussion about savings and investment rate. What are these steps that the government of Pakistan is planning to take in terms of increasing the financial literacy in Pakistan?
Well, I think that the people of Pakistan are today more informed on economic issues and financial issues than perhaps before, and part of that credit goes to maybe the opposition this time, because they've like taken the lead on focusing on economic issues and even micromanaging quarterly targets this time on the revenue issues. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's a step in the right direction. The media is now focused more on financial issues that matter more. Although it's in an imperfect way, there are oversimplified debates, there are sensationalized debates, there are politicized debates on the economy as well. But financial literacy is definitely on the rise in Pakistan, and people are more aware today of the economic and financial issues than before. And I think both the government and the opposition have to take credit for that. There has never been, I think, such an open debate and open discussion on economic issues as there is today in Pakistan. I mean, people are fed up of political rhetoric and petty political point scoring on talk shows. And today, at least on some talk shows, we find that there is serious discussion on financial issues.
Thank you for that answer. The next question is, and I direct that to Dr. Ismail, who were in the last government's tenure, in terms of which is where most of the CPEC investment has seemed to come in. What contributions are expected from CPEC specifically with regards to uplifting the economy? Because there does seem to be a bloated narrative around it.
Okay, so CPEC is basically, CPEC has two parts. One is a huge Exim Bank loan, if you will, that China was willing to give to Pakistani companies. In 2014, US Exim Bank had a $500 million limit on Pakistan. I think the total European EU limit was also 500 million euros. And here was China initially willing to write a check for $45 billion for investments in Pakistan in various factors. And then it went up to like 60-some billion dollars. And that meant, like, I mean, the debilitating power shortages that you had. So you can set up some, power plants, which we did, I think. And you can set up motorways and stuff like that. And then there was a second part to it, and which the second part was setting up enterprise zones. I forget what they call SEZs, special economic zones, where presumably or hopefully you're hoping that Chinese business would open up factories in Pakistan. And not just export out of Pakistan to China, but export out of Pakistan to Western markets, as well as sell some stuff in Pakistan. So I think that is the second part, is where we increase a lot of employment and stuff like that. That really hasn't happened yet. And again, if you are trying to bring Chinese investments in Pakistan, you have to, it's not just a matter of Pakistan becoming very good friends with China. It's a matter of you have to compete with Vietnam, Cambodia, even Ethiopia, and other countries who are giving really good incentives to investors to come and invest and all that. Pakistan has a huge market, but there was issues with gas and power, and still to this day there is issue with gas and power, and whether you're supplying it continuously and at what rate. So those things need to be done to really get benefit out of the CPEC and become and get Chinese investments in Pakistan, and then Pakistan becoming part of the global supply chain, which really we are not. There was one thing that I've not mentioned, which was the rail ML1 thing, which I think now they are doing, which is going to improve the railways a lot. But I was not a fan of that, actually, even when during our government. I sort of was really not happy about that ML1 part. And to this day, it's not clear to me that ML1 is a good CPEC investment, but other investments seemed okay and seemed good. But ML1, I was kind of reluctant.
The next question touches upon the broader theme of sort of consensus building on the economic functioning of the country, and it directly asks Dr. Ismail and Mr. Hammad Azhar that why is there no debate on economic issues within the parliament? I would give the floor to Mr. Hammad Azhar.
Well, no, I would differ with that. I think there is phenomenal debate in Parliament now on economic issues. And I think it's unprecedented, the number of hours that are spent in debate on the budget in the last session, and the session before that was unprecedented. I think in the recent history, there has never been so much debate on economic issues. And whether that leads to an economic consensus or not, I sincerely hope it will. There is, within the rhetoric, within all the political point scoring, sometimes I do feel that there are areas of consensus emerging within the government and the opposition parties. For example, I personally feel that there is a 70 to 80% consensus on state-owned enterprises, barring one party that is still holding on to some ideals of socialist theory or of the 70s or 60s, but I think there is pretty much consensus on that front as well. I think there is some emerging consensus on state banks' autonomy as well within the main political parties. I think there is also consensus on the prudent management of the exchange rate and the need for productivity enhancing measures, simplification of taxes. There is, I think, tremendous consensus as far as simplification and harmonization of taxes is concerned. So there is a silver lining. I think that there is a fragile consensus or a nascent consensus emerging within the political parties as well on these issues.
Dr. Ismail, I see that you were smiling when Mr. Hammad Azhar touched upon the topic of prudent management of the state bank and the exchange rate. With respect to the broader question at hand, the ongoing debate in the parliament with respect to the issues of the economy, what is your opinion on that? Can a consensus be forged?
I agree with what Hammad said. I have nothing further to add except to just, if I may, just make a joking aside, that when you talked about that one party still believing in that socialist thing, was he referring to Asad Umar or?
No, I wasn't referring to your party. That's another party.
No, I was saying Asad Umar. I mean, because he was the one who talked about public sector enterprises always being in public sector.
And then another question is that I would give to Mr. Nazar that has come in as sort of what are the weak and strong points of the economic policies in your opinion? A brief comparison within the PTI's government and the PMNN's government, and what they can do to learn from each other. And before you begin answering, after this, I will be handing it over to the president of the conference for his concluding remarks.
Thank you. Very quickly, I think my view is that the Pakistan's issues, are very fundamental and they haven't changed much. So there might be some, opinions on who performed better, who did not, and PMNL ruled for many years, even before the last its tenure, and the PTI has ruled for 2.5 years. So it is difficult. I think not difficult, but I think it would be unfair if I just point it down to PTI, PMNL, because my fundamental view is that the Pakistan's ruling elites and also the multilaterals in terms of direction of what reforms they should have taken, what steps they should have taken, they have not done that. And I think this kind of political debate will, divert the attention to, some kind of a blame game. I think we need to focus on what should be done, what can we learn from the past, and more importantly, what can we learn from the experience of the East Asian economies that have done so well for the last 40 years. Instead of looking towards America, Turkey, or Saudi Arabia, we should be looking towards the East. That's where the economic miracles have happened, not just in China. And I'm sure we can learn a lot from that. Just a very quick point. We talk a lot about China. Let me share, I lived in Singapore for 7-8 years, and over 50,000 Chinese bureaucrats over the years have been trained in Singapore. And that's was the special request of, the late Chinese Prime Minister Deng Xiaoping. So that says a lot about the humility of the Chinese, that they sent their bureaucrats in thousands to Singapore, a much smaller country. We need to be humble, and we should be open to suggestions, and we need to learn. And we can only learn if we realize that we have done something wrong in the past for decades, not just PTI or People's Party or the PMNL. Collectively, both the civilian governments and the military governments have been responsible for what we are today, and we ought to focus on what we need to do differently.
Thank you for that, Mr. Nazar. I think before we conclude this conference, there is space for one more question that can be asked, and so I will take this time to ask that. It's sent by Leila Gohar, and she asks, why does Balochistan not meaningfully feature in any of the economic planning or the budget committees? And this I address to you, Mr. Hammad Azhar, considering that you are in the government right now.
Right. Let me tell you that this year we've allocated the highest funds for Balochistan in the public sector development program. This has never happened before. And on the top of that, we are coming up with a separate package for the South Balochistan region, because when you look at the Balochistan map, the southern parts, some of the southern parts of Balochistan are where the lowest human development indexes and the highest poverty ratios are and have been neglected for a long time. So we are coming up with that, and Balochistan is certainly the centerpiece of our government's development spending and our priority.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hammad. With that, I leave the floor to the president of the conference, Mr. Mustafa.
Thank you, Faizan. On that note, I would like to thank Mr. Hammad Azhar, Dr. Miftah Ismail, and Mr. Yousuf Nazar for taking part in our panel on the economy of Pakistan. Since this panel marks the conclusion of the LSE Future of Pakistan Conference 2020, I would like to start by thanking my team for their immense support in organizing this event. Hosting it virtually has been very, very difficult, and credit goes to Zirak, Hashir, Sarah, as well as Eric, Gustav, and Bartosz. I would also like to thank the LSE Students Union for their immense support throughout the conference. Credit also goes to the LSE South Asia Center, as well as Dr. Nilanjan Sarkar for being here throughout and providing a lot of advice and support in pulling off this conference. Last but not least, I would like to thank two people, two such individuals without whom this conference would not have been possible. They're both former presidents of this society, and they've each held separate LSE Future of Pakistan conferences in the past, Raza Nazar, as well as Muhammad Afzal. Without your support, this conference would not have been possible. The mission of the Future of Pakistan conference is connecting the minds of tomorrow with the decision and policymakers of today, in the hope of a bright future for Pakistan. With each passing day, Pakistan becomes an ever more crucial player in world affairs. Home of the world's second largest Muslim population, our country will go a long way toward determining what the world looks like a few years from now, which is why the future of Pakistan is one of the greatest challenges before the international community. As president of the LSESU Pakistan Development Society, my main focus for this year's conference was consensus and cooperation, irrespective of party lines and differences in political views. This year, our esteemed panelists, including sitting ministers, lawyers, economists, and opposition members, as well as other key experts, and I'm proud to say that this platform allowed for a unanimous approach on tackling pertinent issues that Pakistan is facing. We discussed whether constitutional provisions adequately protect the fundamental freedoms of people living in Pakistan. For our first panel, the renowned speakers include Dr. Shireen Mazari, Barrister Etazaz Ehsan, and Ms. Reema Umar, who came to the conclusion that the gap between aspiration for basic rights and actual enforcement needs to be bridged. Most notably, Dr. Mazari stressed that responsibility ultimately lies with the civilian government for the protection of fundamental rights, and that her government is taking up a number of issues on the legislative agenda, particularly for women. The panel also agreed that the culture of administration needs to become more rights conscious, and that human rights should be compulsory for education, both at schooling and members of the police force. Our foreign policy panel, consisting of President Masood Khan, Mr. Najam Sethi, and Ms. Hina Rabbani Khar, pointed out that Pakistan's foreign policy is at a crucial juncture. On the one hand, we have high hopes of taking up the Kashmir dispute positively with the newly incoming US administration. And on the other hand, Pakistan cannot subdue to international pressure in recognizing Israel, as that will undermine any efforts made for the right of self-determination of the Kashmiri people, which has been at the core of Pakistan's foreign policy. Our last panel for the conference focused on the economy of Pakistan, and some of its key takeaways were that Pakistan has a huge youth population that has to be harnessed in specialized skilled labor tasks, not only for facilitation within Pakistan for CPEC, but also for manpower export. Proximity of Pakistan to energy markets of the world and its potential as a land of connectivity in terms of energy trade movement of goods and persons was also touched upon. A unique feature of our conference that took the shape of a virtual town hall was the hot seat with Mr. Zulfikar Bukhari session, where we allowed foreign students, both Pakistanis and non-Pakistanis, to interact virtually with the government representative. And that provided a very positive image on how Pakistan is fast becoming a tourist hub and how the government has sought to tap the full potential of overseas Pakistanis. As Pakistani students studying abroad, I think that it is our duty to use our education, exposure, and experience to come back and serve our country to the best of our abilities. We should be confident of our own potential and optimistic about our future, and so should the rest of the world. Pakistan Zindabad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.